Okay, I think we're about ready here. All right, so thank you everyone for joining me. Just want to double check everyone's here. So thank you for joining me to talk about this important topic, especially at this time of year. And thank you for the invitation from the Dean's office to talk about this. Why do seasonal prices defy the laws of supply and demand? So this is based on a really long-term project I've been working on, but published in the past few years about seasonal pricing. One thing you probably learned in your Econ 101 class is that in general, an increase in demand should also be associated with an increase in prices. That is, when more people want something, the higher price you should charge for it. And if you think about, housing markets or just really any kind of stock market, the more people want things, the higher the prices tend to be. But what's interesting is you don't see this trend in seasonal goods. You don't see this trend within seasonal goods. That is goods like flowers on Valentine's Day. Flowers are actually cheaper on Valentine's Day than they are at any time of year, other time of year. Pumpkins and associated pumpkin spice products during fall. I know my wife is very into the pumpkin spice. They're only available and they're substantially cheaper during fall season. And then famously turkeys being cheaper during for Thanksgiving as well. So what I sought to do was to try to explain this trend, both because it's an important trend all on its own and because it might give us more insight into how consumers react to prices and how firms think about pricing. So one thing to note about this is that the way firms implement these pricing discounts, when you take a step back, is a little bit odd. That is, they don't decrease the fixed price. They don't say this product that's $10 during low demand season is going to be $9 now. Instead, they'll say, well, it's still going to be $10, but maybe 20% of the time, we're going to give you a 50% off sale. And I sought to explain why, firms are specifically discounting their products in this way. To do this, we have to think about many other explanations about why firms may exhibit this behavior. Why are firms charging lower prices during high demand season? So some of the other factors we had to consider was loss leadering. That is, when firms charge prices so low that they could even lose money just to try to bring consumers into the store. This theoretically works, though it's hard to demonstrate and it's hard to imagine firms actively losing money on products. But it doesn't make a ton of sense why people would do this for seasonal goods specifically. If you're trying to attract people to your store, you want them to know that prices are lower. So you certainly wouldn't put random variation in there. Furthermore, you might want a product that people buy year round, like milk or bread, rather than soup. And finally, you'd want to advertise to consumers that your prices are indeed lower. Meanwhile, 76% of sales in the data I looked at aren't advertised in any way whatsoever. I also had to think a little bit about price expectations. That is, consumers might be paying systematically different levels of attention to price over the course of the year. That's simply consumers responding to incentives. That is, when there is big discounts, people might pay more attention to prices. People might be checking prices more frequently versus in low demand season when prices are pretty much fixed, they might not be bothering to go see if a sale is on. And finally, from a technical challenge was consumer inventory. Consumer inventory is a really important factor when considering CPG purchases because when a sale is on, consumers might decide to buy many, many units. Well, if a consumer buys many, many units, they're not going to come back and shop with you for a long time after that. Okay. So we need to think about how a consumer's inventory of products relates to their future purchase behavior. When you see someone buy lots of laundry detergent or lots of soup, does that mean they're not buying from your competitor later? Or does that mean they're not buying from you later on? In some categories like laundry detergent, approximating what consumers have in their households is possible. Certainly when you go into a Wegmans, they don't ask you, well, how much laundry detergent do you happen to have at home? But we can roughly assume that people use the same amount of laundry detergent week to week. So if I see how much you buy, I can say, all right, you're roughly going through that at a constant rate, and I can approximate how much you have in your house. For soup, that's obviously not really possible because people change their rates of consumption based on the time of year. So actually trying to estimate how much people have in their homes is technically and computationally a bit more challenging. So I decided to focus on the soup category for two reasons. First of all, it's an excellent example of this dynamic, wherein the price of soup is indeed lower during high demand season. Second of all, the soup industry, I didn't really want to think about competition ideally for one study like this. And what's really nice is that the soup industry is highly concentrated, which is a soup joke for everybody. The soup industry is highly concentrated, meaning it's mainly a monopolist for Campbell's, at least the stores I was looking at. Finally, it showed some of the largest seasonal variations, which was something I was really interested in. And my explanation of this trend is that essentially you've got some people who really, really, truly love soup, right? And they're going to buy soup at any time of year. But you also have this other set of people who are more sensitive to price changes. And they only enter the market when high demand season comes. So even though people want soup more in the winter, in some sense, the average preference for soup, or rather the average price sensitivity of the people who are in the market for soup, is higher during high demand season. Okay, so essentially what happens is during the summer, the only people buying soup are those who really, really want soup, and you can charge them a higher price. And during the winter, you have people who like soup. They like it because it's cold. Actually, I run some additional analysis. It's not just about being cold. It's cold, and when it gets colder is when people like soup. But they're very sensitive to price changes. They don't have as strong preferences, and so firms react to that by reducing prices. To get at this, to really explain why firms both decrease their prices in high demand season and specifically do so using promotional strategies rather than fixed price strategies, we fundamentally need a model that explains why do firms do these random discounts, right? Which is actually not very easy within the literature. And I've got a little bit of a framework here, and I'm just going to check my questions. So I got one question from Michael. Price sensitivity of consumers is higher during the hospitals. Price sensitive demand, people aren't as price sensitive, are more price sensitive during the holidays. That is true, Michael, but you also see the same trends for other categories which show peaks at different times of year. So you will see the price of tuna decline in Lent. You will see the price of ice cream decline in the summer. So it's not just that during the holidays prices go down. It's whenever people whenever people are buying that product. So why do firms engage in these discrete price promotions? Well, what I argue is that you really need sort of a mental cost to checking prices. Okay, you really need consumers to have a mental cost of checking prices. And I've got a bit of a framework here where we have some consumers who really love chicken soup and they're willing to pay $1, and some consumers who really love tomato soup and they're also willing to pay $1, but they're not really willing to switch over. And meanwhile, you have switchers, the more price sensitive consumers. The most they're willing to pay is 50 cents, but they're not so into any particular flavor. They're just going to buy whatever is available. You can imagine that if we didn't have these switchers, right? If these switchers weren't really there, I could just charge a fixed price of 75 cents for the chicken lovers, take all their surplus. I could charge a fixed price of 75 cents for the tomato lovers, and they would be happy. And so I'd have a high fixed price. And I think that's what happens in the low demand seasons. In the high demand seasons, you have these switchers come in, right? The people who don't care about the specific type of soup or brand or variety, but are just willing to buy the lowest price. Now, one thing you could do is change fixed prices. We could say, we're going to charge 75 cents for the chicken and 25 cents for the tomato, okay? And that doesn't involve any randomization, that doesn't involve any random price promotions, but it turns out the firm can actually do quite a bit better. That is, they can do better via randomizing their strategy, by putting on these random price promotions rather than having these fixed price changes. How does that work exactly? Well, you just got to notice that if you charge just 25 cents for tomato, the people who like tomato soup here are really getting quite too good a deal, right? They would be willing to pay up to $1, but they're only being charged, or 75 cents when you take into account the cost of checking the price, but they're only having to pay 25 cents. So instead of fixing one flavor to be cheaper than the others, we can randomize. We can choose, the firm can randomly choose which type of soup is going to be promoted. And it might not be formally flipping a coin, it can be alternating. As long as the consumer doesn't know before they arrive at the store what's going to be on sale, the strategy is going to be effective. And that essentially gets the people who love this type of soup to accept a higher price when it's not on discount. Why? Because they know sometimes they'll show up, it's not on discount, all right, I'll pay the full $1. But sometimes they'll show up and they'll continue to show up because sometimes it will be on discount. And so they'll be getting that great deal. So in this model, why does countercyclic pricing occur? Basically, these switchers enter the market during a high demand season for these different products. Sorry, my slide isn't changing. So for companies, there's a few small takeaways I've got. Basically, what I find is that these price-sensitive consumers are more likely to show up when demand is at its highest. So you can't really think about your consumer base in simple, is demand higher or lower? You really have to, it's really a segmentation exercise that you have to think about, that certain segments are more likely to show up at different times of year. The demand of the price-sensitive consumers goes massively up as a relative share of all purchases during the high demand season. That's why price is lower. Furthermore, I would say that consumers are strategic, that consumers respond to incentives. Consumers are given more incentive to check prices and find that lower price during high demand season because of the firm's own pricing strategy. By putting these large discrete discounts, you've essentially trained your consumers to go find them. Okay. One example from my life of very strategic consumers would be my wife, who I know a lot of people joke that their spouses shop a lot. Mine really does shop a lot. She has 6 wedding kimono, which are called uchikaki. And that's of course concerning to me because I'm her first husband. And so I'm worried she's just gonna go down the line. But when she's shopping for clothes, she knows that firms give discounts to consumers who leave products in their shopping cart. And so even if she really wants a product, she will leave it in her shopping cart and wait for the firm to send the coupon. So you can train your consumers essentially to react to the incentives you give them. On the consumer side, I think the best strategy is to buy when not so much when the demand is lowest, that might not work as well as you'd think. It's buy when the most price sensitive people are showing up, okay? So buy when, for example, when on Black Friday, and we have in different cultures, different specific days associated with price discounts. Black Friday in the United States, Boxing Day in Canada and the UK, Singles Day, November 11th in China. When you buy it though, when you show up, when the consumer base as a whole is price sensitive, you know that firms have the incentive to reduce prices. So following the crowd when the crowd is a price sensitive crowd is the optimal strategy to get the lowest price. And yeah, I think I'm basically on time. So I'm just gonna look at the Q&A and see if there's any questions. So I think I've got the first one. So from Paul Nestler, a large part of this pricing situation is the seller who is so fixated on taking as much market share at the expense of his competitors that he is too willing to drop price. As a result, these sellers set a new market expectation for the price. Paul, I completely agree that I think consumers are, what we see is that consumers are very strategic. There is an expectation now that consumers have that they should see a lower price. And so they're going to keep shopping until they find that lower price, and you'll see the higher prices drop off, and the sales when prices are higher drop off. Okay, Michael, I think I got to your question already about holidays. Nishant, does high demand increase high sales? Therefore, even with discounts due to high volume, it is still beneficial to the company with discounts. Whereas during low demand season, sales are low and the company cannot afford discounts and need to increase prices to match the low demand sales. So Nishant, I think what you should think about is that in these, it changes depending on the context. The context that we're looking at here is grocery stores, which have some products with high demand and some products with low demand. Okay, so at any given time, they're not relying on one specific product category for their flow. Now, I think what you can explain what a different category, like a clothing store, a winter clothing store, you could see some of these trends, right? So there is a different style of seasonality wherein you know, they only sell one product type, and yeah, maybe to keep the doors open, to keep some volume going, to keep their employees, frankly, moving, prices are indeed going to be lower during low demand season. So you don't see counter-cyclic pricing in absolutely every category, certainly. So an anonymous attendee said, how can we apply, sorry if I'm talking quick, how can we apply these learnings to subscription and digital offerings? That's a great question. There's actually a related paper on counter-cyclic offerings. So the idea is that the price of some digital goods is in fact lower during the high demand season for those products. So the specific category they were looking at was sports articles, essentially. So that is, you know, let's say you are interested in basketball. During low demand season, basically all of the premium articles, let's say, about basketball are free, okay? Are paid. Whereas during high demand season, some of those offerings are free and some of them are based on a subscription. So you do see effectively lower prices per basketball content during the high demand season. Okay, so you definitely see these sorts of trends there as well. So sorry, I'm just answering these off the top of my head. From Jean, with items specifically developed for a given season versus just popular in a season, is there any impact on retailers discounting the price to ensure they don't have any remaining inventory, which is then essentially worthless? Absolutely. So in this case, we're thinking more about durable goods than grocery goods or consumer packaged goods. You definitely see that as seasons are coming to an end, people indeed do want to clear their inventories. And in general for retailers, the size of the inventory is a huge component of their inventory management. So we can expect to see discounts when inventories are higher. This is related to a question I got before the seminar started. Because of the recent inflationary pressures and also because of the change in consumer preference based on coming back from COVID. There's been a pretty big shift in what consumers have been demanding from your big box retailers. And that has led to large retailers ending up with more inventory than they want. And in turn, that's going to lead to larger clearance sales. Okay. So things like coffee makers apparently are sitting on the shelves. Timothy, have we thought about how these insights might extract to B2B sales? I think that's a good question. You know, honestly, our data that we get access to, I have great access to data on what prices consumers see, but I don't see very much about the private contracts between firms, which may be a bit more sophisticated. So I would feel comfortable extrapolating these results to any B2B setting where there is essentially a market, where there is essentially ability to search for different products. But I wouldn't feel as comfortable for the more tailored contracts. In terms of seasonal pricing, within B2B though, one context I think about a lot is advertising. So the seasonal market for advertising, which starts with the upfront ad market, which happens, I believe, in May, where they sell advertisements more cheaply for the remainder of the year. And I can tell you those prices are not countercyclic. Okay, so advertisements during high demand season, which is your November and December there as well, are indeed higher. So car buy, so from Nick Jenkins, car buying in December, when dealers are trying to clear out inventory is another seasonal phenomena, better car deals in December. Yes, Nick, and also better car deals often at the end of the month when sales force incentives are higher, you know, they're trying to meet their quota. So I think inventory is a really big part of that. And I think it doesn't affect the CPG context for these smaller products quite as much. But when there is a real carrying cost to inventory, both in terms of tying up your money, like a liquidity constraint, or in terms of, you know, just essentially these cars aren't going to be as valuable, you know, starting with the new model year. There absolutely are better car deals in December. So some other explanations that exist of countercyclic pricing, and again, I think it depends on the context. You can think in some categories, there's marginal costs. So for pumpkins, that was one example from earlier. It's easier to grow pumpkins that ripen during November. It's harder to get a pumpkin in the summer. So there can absolutely be cost benefits. There can be these inventory stories wherein dealers are trying to clear out inventory, though that will be accompanied by a reduction in selection. So from Elizabeth, don't firms increase supply during high demand season, and doesn't that speak to the impact of scarcity on prices during high demand season? So I think you're right, but I think it depends on the product category. So my category that I was studying, and these results, by the way, did get confirmed by a broader study done by other people, which always feels good as an academic. You know, we don't expect a big change in the cost of production of soup by time of year. Theoretically, you know, we know, I've actually been to Campbell's at headquarters, there isn't a big variation over the course of the year in their production costs because soup is such an easily storable good. Now, whether that occurs in product categories where things need to be frozen and maybe the costs associated with, you know, carrying inventory for longer are a bit higher, that might be true. But again, marginal costs definitely have a big impact on pricing. And I think these are great questions and exciting questions because it really gets you to think more deeply about the pricing interactions, right? It's a complicated dance between what suppliers are doing and what consumers are wanting. And the answer isn't always just discount, discount, discount. It isn't always just go with the trend. It is sometimes just thinking about the consumer segments that happen to be shopping at different points in time. All right, and I think I caught up to everybody. So let me know if there's any other questions. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I can talk a little bit more about some of the other challenges that existed here. Well, let me tell you a little bit of a story about data cleaning, okay, that came up in this project. For a while, I was getting some really crazy results out of this model, out of the models I was doing. And for a long time, I thought there was a coding error, okay? So I started doing, you know, what you would call like a phone book search of my code, of my data, wherein, you know, the most efficient way to play that game when someone says guess a name in the phone book and you do a search is you divide the phone book in half and you say, is it in the first half? Yes or no? Is it in the second half? And I started doing that with my data to try to understand what was leading me to see that people wanted high prices. And I was able to narrow it down to tomato soup over a 3-week period in like Pittsfield, Massachusetts was causing all of the problems. That for some reason in the middle of summer in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, people started buying tomato soup at ludicrous quantities. And, you know, I was trying to rack my brain as to why this happened. This is why I think it's really important to research your context. And it was actually my mom who found this. there was an article written about how during that exact time frame in Massachusetts, Campbell's released a promotional can of tomato soup to look like Andy Warhol's paintings. That just for those few weeks, all the tomato soup looked like these collector edition items. And so I think that really speaks to how important it is to know your context and research it well to understand why you might be getting some funky results. And yes, I now own an absurd amount of Andy Warhol memorabilia because everyone associates with me with this. So I really appreciate all the questions. Thank you for not putting me in too much hot water. It's another soup joke for you. And we really hope to see you at the next seminar.